Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of No. 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde, and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful, as she spent most of her time craning it over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think that they could bear it if anybody found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was in fact Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended that she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursley-ish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbours would say if the Potters arrived in the street. Mrs. Dursley knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they'd never seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull grey Tuesday that our story starts, there was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that a strange and mysterious thing would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley chatted happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them had noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little tyke," he chortled as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of No. 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realise what he'd seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat sitting on the corner of Privet Drive, but there was not a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No! Looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards town, he thought of nothing except the large order of drills that he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, the drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic, he couldn't help notice that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes, the get-ups he saw on young people. He supposed that this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell upon the huddle of these weirdos standing close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and he was wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. All these people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later Mr. Dursley arrived in the Grunnings car park, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it rather harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight, though many people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl at night, let alone in the day. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people, he made several important phone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the baker's opposite. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This lot were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, collecting a large doughnut bag, that he caught a few words that they were saying.
"The Potters, that's right, that's what I heard."
"Yes, their son Harry." Mr. Dursley stopped. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whispers as if he wanted to say something to them, but he thought better of it. He dashed back across the road and hurried up to his office. He snapped at his secretary not to disturb him. He seized up his telephone, and he'd almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his moustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure that there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't sure that his nephew was called Harry. He'd never met the boy. He might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset whenever anybody mentioned her sister. He didn't blame her. If he'd had a sister like that... But all the same, those people in cloaks... He found it harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was so worried that he walked straight into somebody outside the door. "Sorry," he grunted, and the tiny little man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realised that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem upset at all at being knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare,
"Don't be sorry, my dear sir, but nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who is gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating on this happy, happy, happy day."
And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He'd been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought that he'd been called a muggle, whatever that is. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off home, hoping that he was imagining things, which he'd never hoped before because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it did not improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behaviour, Mr. Dursley wondered? Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Nextdoor's problems with her daughter, and how Dudley had learnt a new word, shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally, and when Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, birdwatchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although the owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen during the day, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newsreader allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious. And now, over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Are there going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim?
"Well, Ted,"
said the weatherman,
"I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain that I promised yesterday, there's been a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not till next week, folks, but I can promise that tomorrow will be wet."
Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper of the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you?" As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended that she didn't have a sister.
"No," she said sharply. "Why?"
"Funny stuff on the news," Mr. Dursley mumbled. "Owls shooting stars. There were a lot of funny people in town today."
"So?"
snapped Mrs. Dursley. "Well, I thought maybe it was something to do with, her lot." Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through her pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared to tell her that he heard the name Potter. He decided that he didn't dare. Instead, he said as casually as he could, "Their son. He'd be about Dudley's age, wouldn't he now?"
"I suppose so,"
said Mrs. Dursley. "What was his name again? Howard, innit?"
"Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me."
"Oh, yes," said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. "Yes, I quite agree." He didn't say another word on the subject, so they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have been related to the Potters? And if it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of... well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley got to sleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought, before he fell asleep, was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well what he and Mrs. Dursley thought about them. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixing up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting away to an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no signs of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinking on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed in the next street, nor when 2 owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner that the cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently you'd have thought that he'd just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen before in Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes and a purple cloak, which swept along the ground, and high-heeled, buckled boots. His blue eyes were light and bright and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked. It looked as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realise that he'd just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging around in his cloak and looking for something, but he didn't seem to realise that he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at a cat which was staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He found what he was looking for inside his pocket. It appeared to be a cigarette lighter. He flicked it open and held it up to the air and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the putter-outer, until the only lights left in the whole street were 2 tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone had looked out of their window now, even the beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't have been able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the putter-outer back into his cloak and set off down the street towards number 4, where he sat on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, there, smiling back at him, was a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses exactly in the shape of the markings the cat had had around its eyes. She too was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn tightly into a bun. She looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly.
"You'd be sick too if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day? When you could have been celebrating? I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh, yes, everybody's celebrating all right," she said impatiently. "You'd think they'd be a bit more careful. But no, even the Muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on their news." She jerked her head back angrily at the Dursleys' living room window. "I heard it. Flocks of owls, shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent! I bet that'll be Diddliest Diggle. He never had much sense." "You can't blame him," said Dumbledore gently. "We've had precious little to celebrate for 11 years. "I know that," said Professor McGonagall, "but there's no reason to lose our heads. People are being downright careless out on the streets in broad daylight, not even dressed like Muggles, swapping rumours." She threw a sharp sideways glance at Dumbledore here, as though hoping that he was going to tell her something. But he didn't, and she went on. "A fine thing it'd be, too, if on the very day that you-know-who seems to have disappeared at last, the Muggles found out about all of us. I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore?" "It certainly seems so," said Dumbledore. "We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a sherbet lemon?" "A what?" "A sherbet lemon. They're a kind of Muggle sweet I'm rather fond of." "No, thank you," said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think that this was the moment for sherbet lemons. "As I say, even if you-know-who has gone, my dear Professor, such a sensible person like yourself can call him by his real name. All this you-know-who nonsense. For 11 years we've been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name. Voldemort." Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unsticking 2 sherbet lemons, seemed not to notice. "It all gets so confusing if you keep saying you-know-who. I've never had any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name." "I know you haven't," said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperated, half admiring. "But you're different. Everybody knows that you're the only person that oh, all right, Voldemort was frightened of." "You flatter me," said Dumbledore calmly. "Voldemort had powers I never will." "Only because you're too, noble to use them." "It's lucky it's dark. I've not blushed this much since Madame Pomfrey said she liked my new earmuffs." Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, "The owls are nothing to the rumours that are flying around. Do you know what everyone's saying about why he's disappeared? About what finally stopped him?" It seemed that Professor McGonagall had reached the point that she was most anxious to discuss. The real reason she'd been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day, for neither as a cat nor as a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with such a piercing stare as she had now. It was plain that whatever everybody was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore was the one that told her. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another sherbet lemon and didn't answer. "What they're saying," she pressed on, "is that last night Dumbledore turned up in Godric's Hollow and went to find the Potters. Their rumour is that Lily and James Potter they're dead." Dumbledore bowed his head, and Professor McGonagall gasped. "Lily and James? I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, Albus!" Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice was trembling as she went on. "That's not all. They're saying that they tried to kill the Potter's son, Harry, but he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. Nobody knows why or how, but they're saying that he couldn't kill Harry Potter. Voldemort's power somehow broke, and that's why he's gone." Dumbledore nodded glumly. It's true," faltered Professor McGonagall. "After all that he's done, and all the people he's killed, he couldn't kill a little boy. It's just astounding. Of all the things that tried to stop him, how in the name of heaven did Harry survive?" "We can only guess," said Dumbledore. "We may never know." Professor McGonagall pulled out a lace handkerchief and dabbed her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore gave a great sniff as he looked at a golden watch from his pocket and examined it. It was a very odd watch. It had 12 hands, but no numbers. Instead, little planets were moving around the edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back in his pocket and said, "Hagrid's late. I suppose it was he who told you that I'd be here, by the way." Yes, said Professor McGonagall, and I don't suppose you're going to tell me why here of all places. I've come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They're the only family he has left now. You can't mean the people that live here, cried Professor McGonagall, jumping to her feet and pointing at number 4. Dumbledore, you can't. These people, I've been watching them all day, and you couldn't find 2 people who are less like us. And they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter, come and live here? It's the best place for him, Dumbledore said firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he's older. I've written a letter. A letter? Repeated McGonagall faintly, sitting back on the wall. Really, Dumbledore, you think you can explain all this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today wasn't known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There'll be books written about Harry. Every child in the world will know his name. Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking very serious over his half-moon glasses. It would be enough to turn any boy's head, famous before he can walk and talk, famous for something he won't even remember. Can't you see how much better he'll be growing up away from all that until he's ready? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth, but changed her mind. She swallowed it and said, Yes, you're right. Of course. But how's the boy going to get here, Dumbledore? She eyed his cloak suddenly, as though she thought he might be hiding Harry underneath it. Hagrid's bringing him. You think it wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not saying his heart's not in the right place, said McGonagall grudgingly, but we can't pretend he's not careless. He does tend to— What was that? A low rumbling sound had broken the silence around them. It grew steadily louder as they looked up and down the street for some sign of headlights. It swelled to a roar, and as they both looked up at the sky, a huge motorbike fell out the air and landed on the road in front of them. If the motorbike was huge, it was nothing to the man that was sitting astride it. He was almost twice the height of a normal man, and at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wild. Long tangles of bushy black hair and beard hid most of his face. He had hands the size of dustbin lids, and his feet in their leather boots were the size of baby dolphins. In his vast, very muscular arms he was carrying a bundle of blankets. Hagrid, at last, said Dumbledore, sounding relieved. And where did you get that motorbike? Borrowed it, Mr. Dumbledore, sir, said the giant, climbing carefully off the motorbike as he spoke. Young Sirius Black lent it to me. I've got him, sir. No problems, was there? No, sir. The house was almost destroyed, but I got him, and right before the Muggles started swarming around. He fell asleep as we were flying over Bristol. Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside, just visible, was a baby boy fast asleep. Under a tuft of jet-black hair over his forehead, they could see a curiously shaped cut, like a lightning bolt. Is that where— Professor McGonagall said. Yes, said Dumbledore. He'll have that scar forever. Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore? Even if I could, would I? Scars can come in very useful. I have one myself above my left knee, which is the perfect map of the London Underground. Well, give him here, Hagrid. We'd better get this over with. Dumbledore took Harry in his arms and turned towards the Dursleys' house. Could I say goodbye to him, sir? Asked Hagrid. He bent his great shaggy head over Harry and gave him what must have been a very scratchy kiss. Then, suddenly Hagrid burst out a howl like a wounded dog. Shh! Said Professor McGonagall. You'll wake the Muggles. Sorry, sobbed Hagrid, taking out a large spotted handkerchief and burying his face in it. But I can't stand it. Lily and James Potter, they're dead, and poor little Harry off to live with the Muggles. Yes, it's all very sad, but get a grip on yourself, Hagrid, or we'll be fined. Professor McGonagall patted Hagrid gingerly on the arm as Dumbledore stepped over the low garden wall and walked off to the front door. He lay Harry gently on the doorstep and took a letter out of his cloak. He tucked it inside the blankets, and then he came back to the other two. For a full minute the 3 of them stood silently. They looked at the little bundle.
Hagrid's shoulders shook, Professor McGonagall blinked furiously, and the twinkling light that usually shone from Dumbledore's eyes seemed to have gone out. "Well," said Dumbledore finally, "that's it. There's no business staying here. We might as well go and join in on the celebrations." "Yeah," said Hagrid in a very muffled voice. "I'd better get this bike back. Good night, Professor McGonagall. Mr. Dumbledore, sir." Wiping his streaming eyes on his jacket sleeve, Hagrid swung himself on the motorbike and kicked the engine into life. With a roar, it rose and rose into the air and off into the night. "I shall see you soon, I expect, Professor McGonagall," said Dumbledore, nodding to her. Professor McGonagall blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked back down the street. When he reached the corner, he stopped and took out the silver putter outer. He clicked it once, and the 12 balls of light sped back into their street lamps, so that Privet Drive suddenly glowed orange, and he could make out a tabby cat slinking round the corner and out the other end of the street. He could just see the bundle of blankets on the step of number 4. "Good luck, Harry," he murmured. He turned his heel, and with a swish of his cloak, he was gone. A breeze ruffled the neat hedges of Privet Drive, which lay silent and tidy underneath the inky sky. This was the very last place you'd expect astonishing things to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside his blankets without waking up. One small hand closed on the letter beside him, and he slept on, not knowing that he was special, not knowing that he was famous, not knowing that he'd be awakened soon, in a few hours' time, by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put the milk bottles out, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He couldn't know that at this very moment people were meeting in secret all over the country and holding up their glasses, saying in hushed voices, "To Harry Potter, the boy who lived."